You push another piece of wood into the hearth. The flames rise, smoke rolls into the rafters, and the pile of fuel beside you gets a little smaller. That is winter heating in a medieval English house in one picture. Heat, smoke, and a resource disappearing at exactly the same time. No radiator, no boiler, no thermostat, and in many houses, no chimney carrying the smoke neatly away. But the strange part is not that medieval peasants had no way to heat themselves. They absolutely did. The strange part is what keeping that heat alive required, because once you follow this fire backward, out of the house and into the medieval landscape, a simple question about staying warm turns into something much bigger, and the fire itself stops looking simple. At Wharram Percy in North Yorkshire, archaeologists excavated the remains of later medieval peasant longhouses. Their living areas included central hearths. So this is not guesswork based on a painting of somebody looking cold. The hearth was physically there. One of these houses might have a living area around the fire, another room beside it, and a cow byre beyond a cross passage. And right in the human part of that arrangement sat the thing that mattered tonight: fire. The same fire could warm the household and cook its food, which sounds like we have already answered the question. Cold house. Make fire. Problem solved. Except medieval domestic architecture leaves us a rather obvious clue that the solution came with a cost. Look up. In many English houses before domestic chimneys became widespread, the hearth was open to the room. Smoke rose above the fire, moved through the interior, passed into the rafters, and escaped through openings in the roof. We know this not only because historians describe the system. Some surviving medieval roofs are still smoke-blackened. The building kept the receipt, and that changes the thumbnail. The peasant beside the smoky hearth is not sitting next to a fireplace that failed. The fireplace is doing exactly what this kind of hearth was supposed to do. The fire is burning, the person is getting heat, and the smoke has to go somewhere. That already makes the medieval room feel very different from ours. But smoke is not actually the problem that drives the rest of this story. The real problem is sitting lower down, beside the hearth, the fuel pile, because a modern heating system is exceptionally good at hiding what it consumes. You can turn up the heat without watching a piece of the energy supply physically disappear in front of you. Here, the relationship is impossible to miss. Want more flame? Feed it. Want it burning longer? Feed it again. Every increase in warmth makes the pile smaller, and once the pile is gone, the most sophisticated open hearth in England is just a cold patch of floor. So the question changes. Not, how did medieval peasants make a fire? Humans had been rather good at that for a very long time. The better question is, how do you keep one fed through winter? Now the story has to leave the house. Medieval manuscript calendars make this transition almost suspiciously convenient. In one calendar, January shows a man warming his feet beside a fire while food is being prepared. Turn to February. Men are cutting trees and gathering firewood. That does not mean every medieval family followed the calendar like a work schedule. These are artistic representations, not surveillance footage, but the connection was visually familiar enough to put on the page. Winter warmth here, wood cutting there. The fire is the comfortable end of the process. The axe, the bundle, the walk home, those belong to the other end. And suddenly our heating system has acquired legs. Someone has to leave the warm space to keep the warm space warm. Wood was one possibility. Brush, reeds, and other vegetation could matter depending on place. And in landscapes where it was available, peat or turf could be dug for fuel. That gives us much better scenery than a medieval law book. A tree, a patch of common, a fen, a person carrying fuel home. And then the problem changes again. Because seeing wood does not mean owning wood. Seeing peat does not mean being allowed to dig as much peat as you want. This is where the medieval landscape stops behaving like empty scenery. Land could carry rights. Among historical English rights of common were estovers, rights involving the taking of things such as wood, reeds, heather, or bracken, and turbary, the right to dig turf or peat for fuel. You do not need to remember either word. The household beside our hearth certainly does not become warmer because we learned medieval vocabulary. What matters is much simpler. There can be fuel on the other side of the door, and a rule between you and it. That is the real midpoint of this story. At first, the fire looked like the heating system. Now the fire looks like the mouth of a system. It keeps swallowing fuel. The fuel comes from a landscape, and access to that landscape can depend on custom, tenure, and local rules. So the governing question changes from, what did they use to stay warm? To, who could keep the fire supplied? Downham in the Cambridgeshire Fens lets us see that problem unusually clearly. Peat from the fen was useful enough that local regulations counted it, and in 1381, not everyone received the same allowance. Tenants with larger holdings were allowed 20,000 turves. Half-sized holdings received 10,000. Cottagers received 5,000. 20, 10, 5. Same manner, same basic human use for fuel. Very different formal quantities. Now, there is a dangerous temptation here. It would be easy to say that the household with 5,000 turves must therefore have been 4 times colder. We cannot say that. We do not know their exact fuel mix. We do not know the temperature inside each house. We do not know precisely how every household used its allowance. But we do know something more interesting than an invented temperature. Access was not automatically equal. The physical fire may obey the same rule in every cottage. Put fuel in, get heat out. But the social route to that fuel could be different before anything reached the flames. That is a very medieval change in the problem. For many people today, the restriction appears mainly as a bill, a meter, an energy price, or whether the infrastructure reaches your home. In a documented medieval system like Downham's, part of the restriction could appear in a different place. What land do you hold? What customary access comes with it? How much may you take? Same need, different gate. And if this were only a story about unfair medieval rules, we would now have a villain, shake our heads for 30 seconds, and go home. Except the fen produces another problem. People are taking fuel out of it, year after year, and that resource is not infinite. In 1409, Downham issued another rule concerning turf digging. This time, the reason written into the regulation is extraordinary because it gives us the next consequence almost directly. Excessive digging year after year was devastating the marsh. Now stop looking at the household for a second and look at the ground. The hearth needs fuel. More households need fuel. People cut or dig what they are permitted to use, but if too much is removed, the place supplying that fuel can deteriorate. The solution has created its own limit, and suddenly restricting extraction is no longer just a random medieval authority being difficult. There is a conflict. The household needs heat this winter. The landscape has to keep providing resources after this winter. Take too little and someone absorbs the shortage now. Take too much and the resource itself absorbs the damage. That is much more interesting than simply asking why medieval people did not build a bigger fire. A bigger fire has a bigger appetite, and appetites scale. By 1441, Downham's rules were distinguishing access even more sharply. People without the relevant cottage or landholding could be excluded from profits taken from a common that included turf and wood. Some cottagers could take resources for their own support but not for sale. Again, the terminology is not the story. The consequence is, one person can look at the same patch of landscape and see usable fuel. Another can look at it and encounter a limit. The fire in both houses still burns exactly the same way. The path feeding those fires does not. And now think about how different our original room looks. At the beginning, all the important actions seemed to happen inside it. A person, a hearth, smoke, cold outside. But the longer we followed the fuel, the larger the room became. The hearth connects to whoever gathers or carries the fuel. That connects to woodland, brush, or fen. The landscape connects to customary access. Access connects to status and local regulation. Regulation connects to the fact that the resource itself can be overused. One little flame has quietly connected a human body to an entire landscape, which is also why the smoke in that first room is no longer the strangest thing about it. The smoke is visible. Most of the system keeping the fire alive is not. And this is where the medieval calendars suddenly make more sense. A man warming his feet in January is a comfortable image. Men cutting and collecting wood in February are the missing half of the same image. Warmth does not begin when the flame appears. It begins earlier, with the work and access that make the flame possible. That is the part modern heating makes very easy to forget. The energy chain has not disappeared. Something still has to produce the energy. Something still has to move it. Infrastructure still has to exist. Access still matters. Someone still pays. Rules still decide things. We have simply moved much of that chain away from the chair where you feel warm. The medieval hearth did not allow that illusion. Its dependency could be sitting beside it in a pile, and the pile could visibly shrink. So, how did medieval English peasants stay warm without modern heating? The immediate answer really is fire. Archaeology gives us central hearths in peasant houses, such as those at Wharram Percy. Surviving medieval buildings preserve the evidence of open fires and smoke passing through roofs before chimneys became common in ordinary domestic architecture. Medieval imagery connects winter warmth with the labor of collecting fuel. And records from places such as Downham reveal that fuel was not simply a limitless substance waiting outside the door. Access could be counted, divided, and restricted, partly because different people held different rights, and partly because intensive use could damage the resource everyone depended on. Now go back to that first fire. You push another piece of fuel into it. The flames rise. The smoke rises. The pile gets smaller. At the beginning, that looked like three tiny details inside one medieval cottage. It was actually the whole story. The flame is heat. The smoke is the cost you can see, and the shrinking pile is the doorway to everything you cannot. The labor, the landscape, the rights, the limits. The medieval answer to winter was not simply knowing how to make a fire, it was having a way to keep feeding one.